Hello and welcome to Patriot Pets. My name is Lake Green and I am so excited to be here today for yet another lecture video in the Fall 1776 lecture series where we are examining step by step the most pivotal campaign in American history. Without the 1776 campaign, without the outcome of American victory and the daring, unpredictable, unlikely events and efforts that occurred by the men, by just the circumstances in general of all those involved, we wouldn't have a free American country. In today's video, we are going to discuss the Battle of White Plains, which occurred on October 28, 1776, 246 years ago. Before we go into any details, again, I can only talk so much in a 10-minute video, so please, if you want more information, consult David McCulloch's 1776. It's a phenomenal book. It's going to tell you way more than I can tell you. It's easy, it's palatable, it's engaging. Please check it out. By mid-October, following the Battle of Pell's Point, Washington's army barely escaped encirclement on Manhattan and in the Bronx by the British. Had it not been for John Glover and his Marblehead fishermen, they decide to retreat northward to White Plains, New York, above Westchester County, to regroup and reform, hoping that they can stem the tide and the advance of the British Army, hoping for a victory, something that's going to change their fortunes here, as they've pretty much been constantly on the retreat since August. Washington and his men fortify positions on high ground around White Plains. His positions extend for over 3 miles. These positions are highlighted by a lot of trenches on high sloping ground, which Washington hopes will give his men the advantage during the attack. Also, there's a nearby hill called Chattan Hill. Washington makes a strategic blunder and does not defend or fortify this position in advance, even though it's a pretty significant high ground position that should have been defended from the get-go by American forces. He has to hastily send men there during the battle, as we'll find out, to react to the British and Hessian soldiers who advance on his positions. There's a lot of skirmishing that happens in the period that follows up and leads up to the Battle of White Plains throughout upstate New York. In a very brief summary of that, William Howe and his army marched north from New Rochelle, intending to attack the Americans at White Plains. They're actually hoping to get to White Plains before the Americans, because at White Plains there's a massive supply depot of gunpowder, of ammunition, of food, of clothing that the American army sorely needs. Remember, they've been on the retreat pretty much since August. It's now the middle of October. Most of the men are still in their summer clothes. And, if you're wearing pretty much the same pair, maybe if you're lucky, 2 pairs of clothes in 2 months every single day straight, I get it, it's the 1700s, it's not like today. But American soldiers are pretty much in rags at this point. They're becoming ragged, they're becoming increasingly more hungry, starting to really become desperate for food, and just the conditions in general in Washington's army are just getting worse and worse. So eventually the British realize that there's a lot of supplies here in White Plains, and they try to get there before the Americans do. Washington, as his men march northward towards White Plains, around October 20th, he sends Rufus Putnam on a reconnaissance mission to locate the whereabouts of the British army. Putnam realizes just how close the British army is to White Plains and reports right back to Washington, telling him that the British are very close to the supply depot there and that Americans need to get there in haste. On October 21st, the first men to arrive at White Plains are men under the command of William Alexander, Lord Stirling. He was captured at the Battle of Brooklyn, as we talked about earlier in the series, in the first episode, after he led the brave Maryland men to their certain deaths to hold off thousands of British soldiers as the rest of the Americans retreated across the Gowanus Creek. He did so successfully and was captured by the British. He was actually treated very well by the British due to the fact that he was an officer, and also because the British actually respected him after his impressive showing of bravery. He led 200 plus men in the face of a couple thousand fearlessly and never abandoned them. So the British had a lot of respect for Sterling after that, as did the Americans. He was actually exchanged in a few weeks following that in a prisoner exchange for Governor Brown. This guy was actually the governor of the Bahamas, and he had been captured in the spring of 1776 by American troops that went to raid the Bahamas. Yes, the Bahamas in the Caribbean, to seize gunpowder. Those were early American Marines, part of the Continental Navy, under the command of Esek Hopkins. So this guy had been captured months prior. The British wanted him back, and the Americans traded him for Sterling. So Sterling is now back in command of troops. Sterling's men get to White Plains and attempt to fortify themselves in the best they can. Washington already has some defensive lines drawn up there prior to the battle. Throughout the day on October 21st, more and more Americans arrive on the scene. Howe waits for most of his army to consolidate around White Plains for several days. This actually gives Washington an advantage. He also needs his men to arrive and consolidate and organize. He finally does so, and on October 28th, the British finally decide to attack. They attack in two columns. On the left side, men under the command of Johann Rall, a Hessian officer, Hessian troops attack on one column, and on the other, men under the command of Sir Henry Clinton, British regular soldiers, attack on the right. In two columns, they advance towards the American positions. They actually bypass the other heights and focus solely on Chattan Hill. Washington, at this point, had only defended the hill with inexperienced New England militia. A very bad call by Washington. Washington realizes right away that the British are aiming to capture this important position, and he knows that there's no way experienced British and Hessian soldiers can be held off by purely inexperienced New England militia. He orders a brigade of troops under the command of Alexander McDougall to advance to Chattan's Hill. These men are made up of New Yorkers, Maryland men, and men of the 1st Delaware Regiment under Colonel John Hazlett. These men of the 1st Delaware Regiment are known as the Delaware Blues. They're actually equipped in full blue uniforms. The American Army would later adopt a full blue uniform in the American Revolution. But at this time, most of the American men don't have any uniforms. They're just wearing their regular clothes. These Delaware men are the exception. They're fully clothed in blue. They look like professional soldiers, and they have modern muskets. Most American men just carry the muskets that they've been using for years from their farms, whereas these men were actually issued up-to-date military muskets. These men are actually crack troops in the Continental Army. John Hazlett is a great commander. He fought with distinction with his men at the Battle of Brooklyn, and actually, due to the fact that Lord Sterling and the Maryland men were able to hold off the thousands of British and Hessian soldiers at the Old Stone House, Hazlett and his Delaware men were able to escape across the Gowanus Creek. They were among the hundreds, if not thousands, of American men that were able to retreat across the Gowanus Creek and owe their safety and lives to the Maryland men in Brooklyn. Hazlett is eager to avenge these men and fight bravely. Initially, Washington sends forward a group of men under the command of Joseph Spencer, men of the 2nd Connecticut Regiment, forward to advance and intercept the advancing British and Hessian soldiers. These Connecticut men actually hold their ground for some time in the valleys and land below Chattan's Hill and the Bronx River, but unfortunately, as they're fighting directly in front at the Hessian soldiers under Johann Rall, Clinton's men come right around the other side and start to flank their position. Clinton's men flanked their position quite successfully, and now these Connecticut men are forced to retreat. The Connecticut soldiers retreat in good order, moving back towards the Bronx River. But at this time, British cavalry, British dragoon troops, arrive on the scene and launch a charge at the helpless American foot soldiers. These men are decimated. They're killed, bayoneted, slashed, cut to pieces by the cavalrymen. And the survivors, although they've begun their retreat quite orderly, firing and moving back and showing good order, are forced to completely retreat. They do so in a completely disorganized and panicked fashion. At this time, attempting to take the initiative, Colonel Johann Rall and his Hessian soldiers charge straight up the heights at Chattan Hill and attempt to take that position from the Americans. The New Yorkers, the Marylanders, and Colonel John Hazlett's 1st Delaware men fire down steeply at the advancing Hessians and actually repulse their attack entirely. The Hessians fall back and then actually decide to occupy another nearby hill to Chattan Hill, which was unoccupied. This is a great strategic move by the Hessians as they bring their cannons up to the neighboring hill and now, on equal footing with the American men, begin to bombard the American position on Chattan Hill with artillery fire. Howe, consulting his officers briefly, hearing the Hessian guns fire, orders Rall and his infantrymen and men under the command of Karl von Donop, another Hessian officer, and Brigadier General Alexander Leslie to form up and attack Chattan Hill in a 3-pronged assault. These men charge straight up the hill. Colonel Rall's men actually attack on the American right. They're on the left, and they'll attack on the American right. And on the American right, there was an experienced militia from New England that we mentioned earlier holding that position. Rall's Hessians, after just firing one volley and then going up with bayonets, completely caused the American militia from New England to panic, drop their weapons, and run away, fleeing the field, leaving the entire American flank now fully exposed. The men from Maryland and New York attempt to hold their ground and try to bend their line to meet the oncoming Hessians from Rall's men, von Donop's in the center, and the British on the other side under the command of Leslie, but are forced to completely abandon this assault in this position in the face of enfilade fire. They do so in good order, though. They do not leave the field in bad order. Eventually, the 1st Delaware men, under the command of Colonel John Hazlett, come to try to reinforce the retreating Maryland and New Yorkers, and they are the last men to leave the hill. They take heavy casualties, and they are the last to leave the hill. The Battle of White Plains ends in complete disaster for the Americans. Although they try to put up a good fight, Washington is simply here outmaneuvered. This is, again, showing the tactical and strategic shortcomings Washington has. He's not that good of a tactician, and at least here, and he suffers because of that. The American troops at White Plains, for the first time on an open battlefield, aren't, thoroughly beaten. They hold their ground and they fight well, but they're just outmaneuvered by a more experienced British force. Casualties on both sides are heavy. The British don't lose as many men. The Hessians lose quite more. The casualty report should be appearing on your screen right now. The Americans suffer heavy casualties as well. It was fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The numbers should be right in front of you. It's pretty high casualties in terms of an American Revolutionary battle. After the battle, Washington retreats with his men northward. This, he hopes, will entice Howe to follow him further up into northern New York. Howe, on the other hand, realizes there's no point in doing that and just turns his entire army south, marching back to Manhattan. His goal and object: to attack Fort Washington and the last 2,000-man garrison under the command of Nathaniel Greene, effectively destroying any American resistance in Manhattan. That will be the subject of our next video. Thanks so much for watching. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Patriot Pits.